The monitors on the 7th floor had gone quiet in the wrong way. Not the silence of a shift change, not the brief lull between rounds. This was a systemic silence, the kind that registered in the body before the mind caught up to it. Nurses at the station on 7 North noticed it first. The way you notice when a sound you've stopped hearing suddenly isn't there anymore. The patient monitoring dashboard, a wall-mounted array that had displayed continuous vitals feeds from 63 beds simultaneously for the past 4 years, showed nothing. Not frozen, not error-coded, nothing, as if the patients on the floor had simply ceased to exist in data. Within 8 minutes, the same report was coming from 7 South, from the cardiac step-down unit on the 6th floor, and from the post-surgical recovery wing. Within 14 minutes, it had reached Suzanne Holloway. Suzanne was the chief executive officer of Meridian Regional Medical Center, a 420-bed Level 2 trauma facility in Columbus, Ohio, that had spent the past 3 years fighting its way up every major hospital ranking in the Midwest. She was 53, a former ER physician who had moved into administration, not because she'd lost the stomach for medicine, but because she'd recognized, during her 10th year of practice, that the decisions made in boardrooms killed more patients than the decisions made in trauma bays. She had spent the subsequent decade building a system she believed in. The call reached her at 6:47 in the morning. She was already in the building. By 7:15, she was standing in the conference room adjacent to the IT command center on the 2nd floor, looking at a wall of screens that should have been showing her a functioning hospital and were instead showing her the digital equivalent of a city after a blackout. The Patient Monitoring Integration Platform, a proprietary middleware system called ClearPath, that connected every bedside monitoring device in the building to the central clinical data infrastructure, had stopped communicating. Devices were still functioning at the bedside level. Nurses could still read local readings. But the central aggregation layer, the system that let physicians monitor multiple patients remotely, that triggered automated alerts, that fed data to the pharmacy and the lab and billing, had gone dark. And Meridian's Joint Commission re-accreditation survey was in 72 hours. Garrett Spence, Meridian's chief information officer, had been awake since 3 a.m. He was 44, aggressively credentialed, and carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the past several hours discovering that none of his solutions were solutions. He stood at the head of the table and delivered his status report with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to present bad news in organizational language. The platform vendors' Tier 1 and Tier 2 support had been engaged. A senior consultant from the vendor's enterprise division, Philip Travers, was flying in from Atlanta. His internal team had ruled out hardware failure, network interruption, and database corruption. The problem was somewhere in the application layer, and they had not located it. Suzanne listened, then asked the question that mattered. Could they restore ClearPath functionality within 48 hours, before the survey team arrived? Garrett took a breath before he answered, "I cannot commit to that timeline with confidence." Suzanne nodded once. She was already thinking through what came next. The same thing she had done when the ER had been overwhelmed during a mass casualty event 4 years earlier, and the protocols had failed. She had opened the floor to anyone with an idea, and some of the best interventions had come from a respiratory therapist and a second-year resident who had never been asked for input before. Hierarchy was useful until it wasn't. This had passed that threshold. She told Garrett to clear the table. She was opening the problem. "To whom?" he asked. "To anyone who can fix it," she said. "We'll offer a $500,000 consulting fee to whoever restores ClearPath functionality within the next 36 hours. Get that out through every internal channel we have." Garrett looked as though he wanted to argue. He was a man who believed deeply in the sanctity of chain of command. But something in the flatness of Suzanne's voice, the absence of any invitation for discussion, made the argument die before it left his throat. The announcement went out at 7:42 a.m. Owen Calloway was on the third floor when his phone buzzed. He read the alert once, standing in the hallway outside the radiology equipment bay, holding a torque wrench and a replacement capacitor for an ultrasound unit that had been overheating on its left channel for 3 days. He was 47. His official title was Senior Biomedical Equipment Technician, which meant he was responsible for the maintenance, calibration, and operational continuity of the clinical devices that medical staff depended on and rarely thought about until they stopped working. He had been at Meridian for 6 years. He read the alert a second time, put his phone back in his breast pocket, and returned to the ultrasound unit. Owen's daughter, Marisol, was 11. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's habit of reading in the car. Her mother, Diane, had died from a pulmonary embolism 37 months ago. Sudden in the way that only certain medical events are sudden, not dramatic, not preceded by warning. Just the particular cruelty of a body that stops without announcement. Owen had come home from a Saturday shift to find Marisol sitting in the hallway outside the bathroom door, very still, holding her phone but not looking at it. He did not think about Diane constantly. He thought about her the way people think about a missing structural element. Not always consciously, but in the slight adjustment of everything that remained. Marisol spent her after-school hours at the hospital's family support center on days when Owen's shift ran late, under the care of a volunteer coordinator named Pauline, whose aftercare program Owen had come to regard as one of the more quietly important institutions in his life. On most evenings, he walked down to the center at the end of his shift, and Marisol would already have her backpack on. He finished the capacitor replacement, logged it in the maintenance system, and moved on to a portable EKG cart on 4 West flagged for an intermittent connectivity error. It was 9:23 when he signed off on that repair. He had not responded to the alert. He took the stairs down to the second floor. He was not sure afterward what the precise moment of decision had been. There had not been a dramatic instant, just a flight of stairs, a corridor, a door, marked Conference Room B, and he had opened it. The room looked different from how it usually did. Garrett Spence stood at the front, with 2 members of his senior IT staff, and Philip Travers, still in his travel clothes, midway through an architectural assessment that was technically thorough and operationally useless given the timeline. 3 others sat around the table. Barbara Vetch, a clinical informaticist from the EHR team. Russ Folan, a network engineer with the sure of a man held together by caffeine and professional obligation. And Suzanne Holloway at the head of the table, watching the room with the attention of someone cataloging everything and reacting to nothing. Owen came through the door in his department uniform, navy trousers, a gray polo with the Biomedical Services logo on the left chest, work shoes built for 12-hour shifts on concrete floors. His badge hung from a lanyard. His phone still showed the morning's alert. Barbara Vetch looked up and assumed, reasonably, that he was there to report a device issue. If it's a service call, you'll want to go back up to. I'm here about ClearPath, Owen said. A pause. Garrett turned from the projection screen, took in the uniform, the badge, the work shoes, and arrived at a conclusion with visible efficiency. This is a technical consultation session, he said, not unkind, but carrying a dismissal that required no raised volume to land, for credentialed IT and clinical systems professionals. The announcement didn't specify credentials, Owen said, without heat, the way someone states a fact they've already confirmed. Travers glanced over, then turned back to the screen. Russ looked at the ceiling. Barbara looked at Suzanne. Suzanne was already looking at Owen. She studied him for a moment. Something in how he stood, not aggressive, not nervous, not performing confidence, registered with her the way certain vital signs had once registered when she still practiced. A steadiness that wasn't default. The kind that came from having been tested. "Tell me what you know about ClearPath," she said. Not a challenge to justify his presence, the start of an evaluation. "I've worked on its device integration side for 6 years," Owen said. "Every piece of equipment in this building that sends data to ClearPath, I've calibrated, repaired, or commissioned. I know the endpoints better than anyone in the vendor's support tier." Garrett started to speak. Suzanne raised one hand slightly. He stopped. 20 minutes, she said to Owen. Owen moved to the open workstation at the side of the table. He didn't ask Garrett to recap what had already been tried, or Travers to walk him through the assessment. He asked one question, directed at Russ, because Russ was the network engineer and therefore the person most likely to have the answer. "Can I pull the raw device handshake logs from the integration middleware? Not the ClearPath event log, the actual protocol-level handshake data between the bedside units and the aggregation service." Russ looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Suzanne. Suzanne nodded. "That log hasn't surfaced anything relevant," Garrett said. Not quite an objection, more a note for the record. "I'd still like to see it," Owen said. Russ transferred the credentials without further comment. Owen sat down and began to read. The room's attention shifted the uncertain way. Attention shifts when no one is sure how to watch something. Travers returned to his notes. Barbara checked her tablet. Garrett stood near the front with his arms crossed, glancing at his watch at intervals short enough to be visible. Suzanne did not look at her watch. She watched Owen. What Owen was doing, which no one else in the room would have known to do, was reading the protocol logs the way a technician reads them. Not looking for the error itself, but for the layer beneath it. The layer that architects and engineers tended not to examine, because they had built it and therefore believed they understood it, and what you believe you understand is rarely what you look at carefully. Owen had spent 6 years inside the physical infrastructure of a hospital's clinical technology. He had pulled cable through ceiling panels. He had replaced sensors in wall-mounted monitors while a patient slept 3 feet away. He had calibrated the time synchronization on 200 bedside devices during a network upgrade 18 months ago. A task that took him 11 days and that no one upstairs had known about, because it was the kind of work that only became visible when it went wrong. He was thinking about that upgrade now. ClearPath's aggregation logic depended on temporal correlation, matching data streams from multiple devices to a unified timeline, so a physician reviewing a patient's vitals could see accurate, synchronized readings across monitors. The correlation logic was precise to within a 200 milliken tolerance. Outside that tolerance, the aggregation service flagged a synchronization error, designed to prevent corrupted or misleading data from reaching clinical displays. In a correctly functioning system, that error would log and retry. It would not silence the entire output. But if synchronization errors arrived at a high enough frequency, from enough devices simultaneously, the aggregation service's error-handling logic would hit its threshold and enter a protective standby state, silently, by design. It was a failsafe built into the system in version 3.1 18 months ago to prevent a cascade of corrupted data from reaching clinical displays during a network event. Owen had read the version 3.1 release notes at the time. He had noted the failsafe and considered it sensible. He had also noted that its threshold calibration assumed device-side time synchronization would hold within a standard tolerance. He pulled up the calibration records for the bedside monitoring units in cardiac step-down, then 7 North, then post-surgical recovery. The recalibration records from the network upgrade 18 months ago were there, all devices brought into sync at that time. No recalibration entries since, which was correct. Recalibration wasn't a fixed-interval practice, it was event-triggered. He pulled up the building's network infrastructure logs and looked for events in the past 72 hours. He found it in 11 minutes. 3 days ago, IT had completed a scheduled upgrade of the network time protocol servers. The infrastructure every networked device in the building used to sync its internal clock. Routine, performed after midnight, marked complete with no errors noted. What hadn't been accounted for was a firmware quirk in a specific model of bedside monitor. The Veridia 900 series, deployed heavily across the cardiac and surgical floors 14 months ago, that cached the last known NTP server address instead of querying dynamically. After the upgrade, those units kept reaching out to the decommissioned address. Getting no response, they fell back to their internal clocks, accurate, but running on a slightly different epoch baseline than the new infrastructure. The drift was small. On a single device, it would never have been clinically visible, but ClearPath's tolerance was precise, and 47 units drifting by the same small margin in the same direction had generated synchronization errors at a rate that sometime yesterday morning crossed the failsafe threshold. ClearPath wasn't broken. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, seen what looked like a hospital-wide data integrity problem, and protected the clinical staff from corrupted output. The problem wasn't in the platform. It was in what the platform had been given. Owen leaned back from the terminal, looked at what he'd found the way a person looks at something once the understanding is complete, and only the articulation remains, and turned to face the room. The issue is in the NTP migration from 3 days ago, he said. A subset of bedside units, the Veridia 900 series, on cardiac step-down and both surgical floors, cache NTP server addresses in firmware instead of querying dynamically. After the migration, those units lost sync with the new infrastructure and drifted onto their internal clocks. ClearPath's aggregation service read the resulting timestamp variance as a data integrity event and entered failsafe standby. The platform is working correctly. It's been given desynchronized data and responded exactly as designed. The room went quiet. Russ Folan had straightened almost imperceptibly before Owen finished the third sentence. His eyes moved to his own terminal. Travers stopped taking notes. Garrett's expression moved through several states before settling into something like controlled disbelief. The NTP migration was completed without errors, he said. Not anger, but the sound of a certainty starting to fracture. On the server side, Owen said, the firmware behavior on the 900 series isn't in the standard deployment guide. I know about it because I configured those units when we took delivery. He looked at Russ. Pull the current time offset logs from the 900 series endpoints. You'll see the drift. Russ was already pulling them. 47 units appeared on the shared display, all showing a consistent offset, all within the same narrow range. Barbara exhaled through her nose and set her tablet face down. To restore ClearPath, Owen said, push a firmware update to the 900 series that forces a dynamic NTP requery, let them resync to the new infrastructure, then restart the aggregation service. The restart clears the failsafe state. Once the devices are synced, the error rate drops below threshold and the platform resumes normal operation. He paused. The update file's in the vendor's device management portal. I've used it before on a smaller batch, 40 minutes across all affected units. Garrett found his voice. That section of the infrastructure was reviewed. The server side was reviewed, Owen said, with the same evenness he'd used throughout. Device firmware logs weren't in scope for the migration review. They're in biomedical records, not IT systems. He looked at Russ, who was already nodding, already opening the vendor portal. Suzanne stood. She had watched Owen for 11 minutes without interrupting once, and what she'd seen in that time she was still working out. She had been in enough rooms with enough brilliant people to know that the particular quality of his attention, no performance in it, no interest in who was watching, was not common. Run it, she said to Russ. The update pushed to the first cluster at 10:04 a.m. By 10:11, the synchronization logs showed alignment within tolerance. By 10:38, all 47 units were updated. Russ restarted the aggregation service at 10:41. The wall monitor, the same one that had shown clinical operations, a system in protective standby for over 20 hours, populated. Vitals feeds, room assignments, alert cues. Patient data, clean and synchronized, flowing from 63 rooms across 4 floors. Barbara made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Travers sat with his architectural assessment in front of him and said nothing for a long time. Garrett didn't move. His face had the stillness of a man accounting for something he'd missed and finding the arithmetic unpleasant. Suzanne looked at the display for a full 30 seconds, then back at Owen, who sat reviewing the final synchronization confirmation with the unhurried attention of someone finishing a job properly. He looked up when she turned toward him and waited. "Your daughter is in the family support center," Suzanne said. "I had someone check. Pauline says she's working on a project." Owen nodded. He'd texted Pauline when he came in. "I want to know what I don't know about you," Suzanne said directly, without apology. The voice of someone who had moved past administrative caution into something more honest. Owen was quiet a moment. "It's a longer answer than the 20 minutes you gave me. I have time now." What her team assembled over the next several hours confirmed what Suzanne had already begun to suspect. From the way Owen had sat at that terminal. He had completed a doctorate in biomedical systems engineering at Johns Hopkins at 28, then spent 4 years at a federal health technology research lab producing work published in journals Suzanne had read during her own training. He had joined a medical device company, Central Diagnostics, as a senior systems architect when Central was at the leading edge of patient monitoring technology. He'd spent 3 years there. His departure had come with a non-disclosure agreement and a standard separation clause. What the NDA couldn't suppress entirely was the record of what followed. Central's flagship remote monitoring platform went to market 18 months after Owen left. Passed regulatory review, it was deployed in 47 hospital systems across 12 states. Then, over 14 months, it produced a pattern of alert failures in high-acuity patients, 4 delayed intervention events, 2 of them fatal. The subsequent FDA investigation and a parallel internal review, partially redacted but available in the public regulatory record, described a systematic flaw in the alert threshold calibration architecture, one that internal documents indicated had been flagged by a member of the engineering team before the platform went to regulatory review. The documents didn't name him. The NDA had been written to ensure that, but enough survived in the thread of communications and regulatory correspondence to reconstruct the shape of it. Owen had identified the flaw, documented it, and escalated it. The business timeline hadn't accommodated a delay. When it became clear the path forward required his sign-off on a system he believed would fail exactly the way it later failed, he refused. He lost his career on a Thursday. He was home by Friday. Diane had still been alive then, and Marisol 4 years old. Owen took them to the park that Saturday and didn't tell Diane what had happened until they were on the way home, because he hadn't wanted the afternoon to be about that. When he told her, she was quiet for a long time, then said she was glad he'd done it, and sorry it had cost him what it had. He thought about that afternoon sometimes, the particular grace of being known by someone. He took the biomedical technician certification course 18 months after leaving Central, found work at a regional hospital in Maryland, then a network facility in Cleveland, and finally at Meridian, where the director of facilities had read his application and, to her credit, hadn't asked too many questions about the gap between his academic record and his current title. 6 years in, he had come to understand the interior of a hospital in a way he never had as an engineer. The physical fact of it, the specific way a broken machine here was different from a broken machine anywhere else. He'd stopped thinking of the work as a compromise and started thinking of it as a different engagement with the same problem. He couldn't undo what Central's platform had done. He could make sure the equipment under his care never failed the patients in his building. It wasn't the same thing. but it was the thing he could do. Suzanne read all of it twice, sitting in her office with the door closed, then looked out at the city for a long time, thinking about what it cost a person to be right in a way no one publicly acknowledged, and to carry that quietly for years without asking anyone to witness it. She thought about the Viridia firmware behavior, which Owen had known because he'd personally configured every unit, because he was the person in the building who did that work. She called Marisol's school and arranged for her to be released to the family support center. Then she walked back to the conference room, where Owen was still at the terminal. He looked up, patient, waiting. "The $500,000 award is yours," she said. "I'd like to talk about the rest." The rest, in Suzanne's framing, was a formal position, a newly created role, Director of Clinical Technology Integration, sitting across the gap between biomedical services and IT, the exact gap where the Viridia issue had lived undetected. A budget, a reporting structure, a salary that reflected what his knowledge was actually worth. She'd already cleared it with her board chair. Owen listened to the full offer without interrupting. When she finished, he said he appreciated it, with the same lack of performance he'd brought to everything else. "Then, I need to decline." She had somehow expected it. "Tell me why." "I've spent 6 years learning what happens when I'm in a room where decisions get made by people who don't understand the thing they're deciding about," he said. "I built something once that I believed would help, inside an organization I believed in, and I learned the decisions about it were never really mine. I don't think a title changes that." He paused. "What I'd like, if you're willing to consider it, is something different. A consulting arrangement, project-specific, no standing obligations. And I'd like your help with something I've been trying to build for a long time." What he described was a training program, not for engineers, but for technicians. The people who came up through trade and certification routes, who spent their careers inside the physical and operational layer of clinical technology, who understood the systems from the inside in ways the engineers who designed them often didn't. He'd been thinking about it since the Central investigation, since he understood that the flaw he'd flagged had been missed in regulatory review because the reviewers evaluated documentation rather than behavior. The people who would have caught it were people like the technicians he now worked beside. People who'd have noticed, the way he'd noticed, that the alert calibration logic behaved differently under real clinical load than in a controlled test. But those people were never in the room where that evaluation happened. He wanted a program that put them there. A pipeline between the people who kept the systems running and the people who decided whether those systems were safe. Suzanne looked at him a long moment. "Yes," she said, before she'd fully worked out the structure of it, which was unusual for her, and she noticed that. The award presentation took place the following morning in the same conference room. The transfer document sat on the table. Owen sat across from Suzanne in a clean, pressed uniform. Marisol was at school, where she was supposed to be. He read the document once carefully and set it down. "I'd like to discuss the structure." A board member at the end of the table shifted in his seat. "I'm not declining the award," Owen said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. I'd like to use part of it differently." He looked at Suzanne. "There's an amount, closer to $160,000 covers what I actually need. A down payment on a house in a better school district for my daughter. A tuition fund that handles her education without me making financial decisions under pressure. That's what we need." He set his hands flat on the table. "The rest, I'd like to propose funding the first 2 years of the training program we discussed. Operating costs, curriculum development, stipends. I've run the numbers. $320,000 covers the first cohort of 24 technicians with enough left to seed Year 2's recruitment." He added, "That leaves roughly $20,000 unallocated, which I'd like to keep liquid as a transition buffer. That's the honest accounting." The room was quiet. You solved a problem that put this hospital's accreditation at risk, Suzanne said carefully. A potential loss in the tens of millions. And you're asking to keep less than a third of what you're owed. I'm asking for what I need, Owen said, and for what might actually do something worth doing with the rest. Those are different things. The board member cleared his throat. Owen looked at him with the same patient, uncontested calm he'd carried through the whole encounter. And the board member said nothing. Owen signed the document. The door opened 20 minutes later. Pauline had had to leave the support center early. A family situation, and the front desk sent Marisol up in her school uniform, backpack on. She spotted her father at the far end of the table and crossed the room. He turned and caught her the way a person does when they've done this exact thing many times, and will do it many times more. She said his name against his shoulder. Several people at the table found their documents suddenly interesting. Garrett, seated near the door, looked at his phone in a way that wasn't convincing. Marisol leaned back from her father's arms and surveyed the room with the direct appraisal of a child who doesn't yet understand why adults find these moments uncomfortable. "Did you fix the hospital?" she asked. "I helped." She considered this. "Pauline said you were fixing the hospital." She looked at Suzanne. "He's really good at fixing things. He fixed our dishwasher twice." Two people at the table laughed despite themselves, and the weight that had filled the room for 36 hours went somewhere it couldn't come back from. 3 weeks later, Garrett requested a meeting with Suzanne and proposed a departmental restructuring. She listened, then asked a series of pointed questions about the NTP migration review process, about why biomedical equipment logs had been excluded from its scope, about the team culture that had led a concern about the clear path, fail-safe logic, raised informally by Russ Folan 9 months earlier, pass without escalation. Garrett answered. She thanked him and said she'd be in touch. She accepted his resignation the following week, restructured IT leadership to sit closer to clinical operations, and created a formal bridge role between biomedical services and clinical informatics. For the first time, biomedical technicians were included in the quarterly technology review meetings. The first cohort of Owen's training program enrolled 8 months later. 22 biomedical and clinical equipment technicians from hospitals across the Midwest, chosen through a competitive process Suzanne's foundation office helped build. Owen designed the curriculum himself evenings and weekends, at the kitchen table while Marisol did her homework across from him. He found that the boundary between the life he'd built and the work he'd walked away from wasn't the wall he'd once made it. It was possible to step back in, not as the man he'd been at Central, who had trusted institutions more than the evidence warranted, but as someone who understood their interior well enough to change what needed changing without being consumed by it. Suzanne called him on a Tuesday afternoon with a question about a participant's project, a proposal to redesign the device commissioning checklist at a rural critical access hospital. They talked for 40 minutes. He was standing in the backyard, watching Marisol practice cartwheels on the grass, and hadn't gone inside when the call started because the afternoon was good. The house sat in a neighborhood with a solid elementary school and a library within walking distance. Marisol had claimed her room the moment she saw it, walked in, sat on the floor, looked at the light from the east-facing window, and announced the decision. One Saturday, Owen fixed the front porch steps, which had a soft spot the inspector had flagged and the previous owner had lived with for years. An easy repair once you understood it. The board wasn't rotten, the joist beneath it had settled slightly, flaccing at the fasteners over time. Shim, reset, refasten. 20 minutes once you knew what you were looking at. He thought, while he worked, about threshold calibration, about how systems, mechanical or clinical or organizational, develop failures at the layer everyone assumes is stable, because the assumptions are the last thing anyone checks. It was the same principle at every scale he'd ever worked. Catastrophic failure almost never begins as catastrophic. It begins as a small misalignment in a place no one is watching, compounding quietly until it looks, from the surface, like a mystery. The steps held after that, clean and level, the way a repair holds when it addresses the actual cause. Marisol had come out for the last 10 minutes of it, sitting on the bottom step with a book in her lap, offering no opinion on his technique. When he finished, she said he was kind of like a doctor for houses. He thought about that for a moment. Something like that. She went back to her book. He put the tools away. There are repairs no one will ever see, finished quietly, in the ordinary hours of a life that looks, from the outside, like it's simply being lived. But the best repairs are never the ones anyone was watching. They're the ones that hold when they need to, for reasons that go all the way down to the foundation, done right by someone who knew what they were looking at. Those are the ones that last.